Hi there, and welcome to Unit 6, Lecture 6. This is the last lecture of Unit 6. Today we're going to wrap up World War I, taking a look at how America was impacted and affected by the entry into World War I in 1917. So in 1917, maybe President Woodrow Wilson, thought it was no longer possible for the United States to remain neutral because of all of the factors that we talked about in the last lecture, the sinking of the Lusitania, British propaganda, the Zimmermann note, German submarine warfare, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so public opinion supported, for the most part, the United States entry into the war. And so in April, President Wilson, made a speech to Congress asking Congress to declare war on Germany and the other Central Powers, to make the world safe for democracy and to enter into a war that would result in the end of all wars. And obviously we know that that was not quite the case. Congress voted, in fact, for the United States to enter into World War I. However, Jeannette Rankin, the first time we see Jeannette Rankin, she was the first United States Congresswoman, and ironically she was from Missoula and Montana. She voted against the war. She was a pacifist. And at this time it wasn't really all that big of a deal, because there were many other members of Congress that didn't feel the United States should enter into this war. However, a little bit later on, this would become an issue with Jeannette Rankin.
Won't you stand up, you girls and boys? Won't you stand up, stand up, stand up? Won't you stand up and use your voice?
The United States began to prepare for the war, and the first thing was assembling a military that would be effective. And so the selective service was instituted. There were over 3 million American men that were drafted. This doesn't mean that all of these men served, while quite a few of them did. And again, like the other times the draft had been instituted, the only other time had been during the Civil War. The draft was a little bit unfair, unequal. There were ways to get out of it. And many people believed that, it was against their right to have to serve if they did not want to serve. And so you had draft riots and people burning draft cards, and actually the Supreme Court ruled that burning a draft card was not a right, according to freedom of speech, that that was harmful to national security and so forth.
Commit yourself. Oh, it's my life. Don't you forget. It's my life. It never ends.
There were also Americans that volunteered to go. The American Expeditionary Force were volunteers. That included actually 14,000 women that volunteered to go over, and they served as operators and nurses and transportation. The U.S. forces in Europe were led by General John Pershing.
Yes, I'm here. I volunteer.
Now here is a picture of Secretary of War Baker pulling numbers in the lottery out of a fishbowl. It wasn't all that scientific. They pulled numbers out, and if your number was chosen, you were drafted. The government, and how it handled the war, this was the first war of such a great magnitude that the United States would be involved in, and so there were many changes. The government became far more involved. Liberty bonds were sold to help finance the war, and basically they sold this to the public like, you are doing your part in helping the United States win the war. Buy these Liberty bonds. It's kind of like giving the government a loan. You buy it for $25, and in 10 years it might be worth $50. But it was fairly effective. It paid for close to a third of the war, was financed through the sale of Liberty bonds. The War Industry Board was established. That the government had the right to take over industry, to force them to produce war materials. again, the United States was not in World War I for all that long, so many of these agencies that were established, boards that were established, were not all that important in World War I, but in World War II, they would be. For example, the War Industry Board, took over some shoe companies and made them produce war boots. And in World War II, they took over part of Ford Automobile and made them produce airplanes. Industries weren't all that upset about it because they had pretty significant contracts from the government, and they made a substantial amount of money. Fuel administration was an attempt to conserve fuel, kerosene, gasoline to save for the war effort. This is where daylight savings was first introduced, where we will be in a month or so here springing forward to gain an extra hour of light for the day. The War Trade Board, for the first time America was involved in a war with many other countries, and so the United States government wanted to make sure that there were no American companies that were trading with a possible enemy or supplying countries with goods that might come back to harm the United States. At the time, the government did not want many strikes going on because they needed the production of these goods, and so the National War Labor Board kind of mediated labor disputes and tried to, solve the disputes before they actually ended up in strike. Food Administration set up the, rationing process, and again, rationing would not become all that prominent in World War I, but it would World War II, where, you received coupon booklets, and in order to get certain goods like meat and eggs, bread, milk, cigarettes, gasoline, you had to have these coupons, and you were only allotted so many per month. And the Committee on Public Information was kind of an advertising group that put out all kinds of material to help gain support for the war. Here you can see some of the war propaganda posters. Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Enlist today, all these things, trying to get people to enlist. First call, I need you in the Navy this minute. Our country will always be proudest of those who answer the first call. On the right here, help crush the menace of the seas, buy Liberty bonds. Obviously, the menace of the seas would be the Germans. Now, when the United States entered the war, Germany, they'd been fighting for quite some time, and they hadn't had a lot of help. And so they were kind of down to their last chance, and they had one last-ditch attempt to try to capture Paris. Remember, Russia was no longer involved in the war, and so the Germans were trying to capture Paris, and in the Great March Offensive, they launched one last massive attack. And in the first Battle of the Marne, the French were aided by the entry of the British in to help protect the French in Paris. And in this one, the United States had just entered. And so the United States were there under the direction of Pershing, and they were able to halt the German offensive at the Second Battle of the Marne. And this time, the first time it ended in trench warfare being the result. This time, the United States had all these new troops there, and Pershing issued a counterattack which pushed the Germans out of France back into Germany, and it would only be a matter of time before the war was over. Now, in terms of peace, there were different ideas on how this war should be settled, and the peace process that should take place. Woodrow Wilson took a look at all of the factors that had come into play into bringing about the war, and he came up with what was called his 14 points for peace. And I only have 4 of them up here that I want you to be aware of. First of all, was he wanted guaranteeing of freedom of the seas. Remember, the German submarine warfare had caused all kinds of problems. So, there were international waters that were free. Ships could not be sunken. Then there were, private waters and so forth. Secondly, open alliances. Remember, this thing had become such a tangled mess because of all the secret alliances. Alliances are fine, but in the future they needed to be open. Countries needed to be aware of who was allied with one another. He wanted some, regulation on the production of weapons. He didn't want this unlimited arms race continuing and countries using their military to further progress their nation. But most importantly, he was a strong advocate of the creation of a League of Nations where countries would send representatives to a body that would try to solve problems peacefully and diplomatically instead of using the military. And he was, a very staunch advocate of this. And eventually, it would develop into the United Nations down the road. However, the leaders of Europe were not really interested in this. When you take a look at Wilson's plan, it was kind of like taking a look at what had caused the war and preventing it from happening again. It was a preventative plan. The Treaty of Versailles, which was actually adopted, had 233 points, and it was more of a punitive plan of taking a look at why the war happened, placing responsibility, and punishing those responsible, and namely that was Germany. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles, for the most part, placed almost the entire responsibility of World War I on Germany. And as a result, Germany lost all its colonies. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Navy, only 6 ships. They wanted to make it so Germany could not provoke or instigate something like this in the future. The War Guilt Clause placed full responsibility of World War I on Germany and forced Germany to pay $33 billion in war reparations to the Allied countries. And that was a significant amount of money. And when they took all Germany's colonies away and through all of this, Germany entered into a severe depression. And the United States was loaning them some money to make these payments and so forth. But Germany hit rock bottom in the 1920s. And Germany was devastated. I mean, the unemployment rate was extremely high, much higher than it had been in the than it would be in the United States during the Great Depression, And so by treating Germany so severely at the end of World War I, it's quite possible that this is what indirectly led to World War II, because shortly down the road, a man would emerge in Germany, an excellent public speaker, and he would promise the Germans a return to their glory. He would promise them jobs. And remember, they're at rock bottom here. And so he promised them hope. And obviously this man was Adolf Hitler. Okay. Now, I just want to take a look at this graphic here for a minute. It shows you the utter destruction of World War I. Okay. So we're looking at killed and wounded, total of nearly 8.5 million killed in World War I. Devastating. Okay? And, the amount of casualties was extremely high. 57% of all of those that fought in World War I were either killed, wounded, missing, or a prisoner. Okay? And that's a significant amount.